Welcome to today's ACOM Accord seminar. Our speaker today is Eleanor Browne. Ellie did her PhD at UC Berkeley in Ron Cohen's group and was a postdoc at MIT with Jesse Kroll. She held a NASA Earth System Science Fellowship from 2010 to 2012 and a NOAA Climate and Global Change Fellowship from 2012 to 2014. This last fall, she became an assistant professor at CU Boulder in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. Her current research focuses on the gas and condensed phase chemistry of reduced nitrogen compounds and how this chemistry impacts the formation, growth, and physical properties of aerosols. Today, she will present us something that was, I think, still done during her postdoc, and has the title, Characterizing Variations in Atmospheric Composition over the period 270 AD to 2013 AD, Measurements of a Greenland Ice Core. Please welcome Eleanor Browne.
Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be here today, and I've had some fantastic conversations. It's been great learning about everything that's going on here. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I did in my postdoc. Even though as part of my postdoc, it is still very much a work in progress. I don't recommend getting a very large data set 3 months before you change jobs, but that's where we are. So what I'll be talking about today is the characterization of an ice core that was drilled in Tunu. Is this not working? Okay, there we go. It just turned off. Tunu, Greenland. So very far north in Greenland. And this is actually a photograph of them drilling the core. I was not part of that. I was very thankful for that. It sounded very cold. One thing notable about this ice core is that it was drilled without drilling fluid. So we're free from organic contamination just before we get started. So I know I don't really need to talk to this audience about the impact of aerosols and climate, but just as a brief motivation, we have various sources that emit gases and aerosols into the atmosphere. These will affect climate via interaction with radiation and by their influence on cloud properties and cloud formation. There's obviously other numerous effects of gases and aerosols, such as health, visibility, those sorts of things. But for the purposes of the ice core, what we're really interested in is thinking about the climate impacts. So you can have these primary emissions in the atmosphere, and then they'll undergo chemistry in the atmosphere. And this will change the composition of these particles and potentially changes how they interact with radiation or how they influence clouds. And what's really important is that this chemistry and the chemical composition of the aerosols is really what determines these climate impacts. So for instance, something like soot will absorb radiation. Perhaps if you coat it with something, it might enhance the radiation. So really understanding the chemistry, both in terms of the composition as well as the evolution, is important for understanding these climate impacts. So what do we actually know about the composition of these aerosols in the atmosphere? So in the AMS, the aerosol mass spectrometer view of the world, so this does not include sea salt or dust or black carbon, so we are missing some very important aerosol constituents. But in terms of everything the AMS can measure, we can see that there's mostly across the northern hemisphere too, so we're pretty biased in this view, but Greenland's also in the northern hemisphere, so we'll just go with it. But the chemical composition is diverse and very variable across location. So you can imagine that these climate impacts are really going to be dependent upon kind of where you are. So when we think about quantifying the impacts of aerosols on climate, we typically see this graph from the IPCC, and here we have CO2, as well as the other long-lived gases in the atmosphere. And then down here we have aerosols and its precursors. And what you can see here is that the direction of the bar is dependent upon the chemical composition. And here we have the impacts of clouds. And typically what everyone points out when they talk about this graph is that these error bars are very large. We don't really necessarily understand these processes, whether that's due to the not understanding chemical composition or any of the physics. Those are both reasons for this uncertainty that leads to a large part of this uncertainty bar here. But what I want to talk about today is that this is really radiative forcing relative to 1750. So not only does it depend on what we know about the aerosols now, it also matters what the aerosols were in what we're doing this relative to. And that is something we don't really know anything about. So a lot of what we currently think mostly comes from models, but as we know, models have somewhat of a difficult time replicating current aerosol. So how do we really know what's been going on since before the Industrial Revolution? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And just a brief overview of where we're going from here. So I'm going to talk about what ice cores are, how we get measurements from them, why they're really nice, and talk about the previous sorts of measurements that have been made on these cores for inorganic and organic species. Then I'm going to talk about how we approached this measurement, and specifically we were interested in changes in the bulk chemical composition. And then I'm going to finish up with talking about some changes in the nitrogen speciation and kind of use it as a motivation and an advertisement for what my group will be starting to work on as we get our lab set up at CU. Okay, so ice cores have been extensively used for numerous different types of measurements because they provide a very high resolution record for understanding the paleoenvironment. So they've been historically used for things like chemical composition, understanding changes in circulation, cosmic ray flux, and even local sources of pollution. So this is kind of how a typical ice core drill will be then cut into these various different cores that some will be archived and then they'll be used for various different things. So we can get lots of different information from just one of these drills. And here's a picture of an ice core. Typically they're stored in about meter-long chunks. And you can really see here what we mean by high resolution record. So these different variations in color each represent, I believe, light represents a summer and dark is a winter, although I may get that, be confusing that right now. But as you can see, you can visually see that we have a sub-annual record preserved in this ice core. And then you can also see unusual events such as this right here would be a melt event where, and that tells you information. It can tell you perhaps how things have changed in the ice core. So these have been used for quite a long time, mostly to look at how the inorganic composition of the atmosphere has changed. And a lot of this has been because inorganics are fairly easy to measure. So in some of these plots, we're going to have kind of a backwards, at least how I'm used to it, time axis. So I'll point that out here always. So this is going from past to present here. And here we have measurements of nitrate and then non-sea salt sulfate. And you can see here that you have various spikes due to differences in either emissions or perhaps circulation. It's very variable, but you also just see this general kind of increase in the baseline of nitrate due to changes in anthropogenic emissions of nitrate. Similarly, you see the same thing with non-sea salt sulfate. So you will have large events. This is probably a volcano. But once again, you kind of see this long-term increase in kind of this baseline measurement. So in addition to kind of these standard inorganic ions, more recently people have been starting to look at different inorganics, such as the soot in the ice core. So on this top graph here, we have black carbon, and then vanillic acid, and then black carbon again, and non-sea salt sulfate. So the vanillic acid is a tracer for biomass burning, and you can see back here, before really the rise of industrialization, that the variations in the black carbon and the vanillic acid track fairly well. And then you can see this large increase in black carbon here. It corresponds to these increases in sea salt sulfate. So biomass burning soot, and then more fossil fuel combustion soot. And what people have done with measurements such as these is to calculate out what the radiative forcing effects have been from these. So by using correlations with these two different tracers, you can make estimates of biomass versus fossil fuel soot, and then estimate what the radiative forcing is from each of those constituents. But this has all been inorganic stuff. And if we go back to our AMS view of the world, we can see that, at least in the present day, this green part, the organic molecules, are a fairly large fraction of the aerosol everywhere. And they're going to have important impacts on how the aerosol interacts with radiation, potentially any brown carbon formation or anything like that, and also its cloud condensation nuclei properties, among other things. So when we think about how these organic species could perhaps have changed over time, there's a few different things that we can think about. So perhaps the one that always jumps to the forefront of everyone's mind is that emissions of organics have changed. So for here we have global emissions change of various biogenic VOCs. So we have isoprene in black, monoterpenes in red, and sesquiterpenes in blue. And this is normalized, I think, relative to 1750, or I think this point right here, wherever that is. And as you can see, so this is going from 1,000 to 2,000, that we have a decrease in isoprene emissions, but the sesquiterpenes and the monoterpenes have increased relative to this kind of 1750 value that we're always calculating pre-industrial forcing off of. And so these are predominantly changes from land use, some temperature-dependent emissions, and things like that. The other thing is that the emissions of anthropogenic VOCs have also increased greatly. So here's just a few different estimates of the global emissions of non-methane VOCs per year, and you see this very sharp increase right around 1950 or so. So from this, we can kind of start thinking about how we might expect the composition of the organics to change. Both we expect to see changes in the biogenic contributions, as well as probably an increase in things that look a little more anthropogenic over this time. The other way that the VOCs, or the organic aerosol that could be made, has likely changed is because we've altered the oxidizing capacity of the atmosphere. So here we have just ozone production curves as a function of NOx. And this is ozone production, but the OH concentration actually looks very, very similar. And so as we've moved from lower concentrations of NOx emissions to higher concentrations or higher emissions, we've definitely, it's likely that the ozone production and the OH are higher. So this might influence how oxidized the organics we observe might be. And these are just examples of different curves at different VOC reactivities. So just a quick note about the organics in the ice core before I start showing you some data that previous people have taken, is that while we're saying we're looking at the aerosol composition, it's really not what you would actually go out and measure right now in the atmosphere as aerosol, because what's deposited onto the surface are both organic and inorganic aerosols, but also gases. And then at the surface, there's potential for chemistry. There can be re-emission, chemical transformations, different things can happen. But with that caveat, we still think that there's a pretty good record in this ice core of how things have changed over time. So previous measurements of organic compounds in the atmosphere or in the ice core, probably the most common measurement has just been this total dissolved organic carbon that's present in the atmosphere or in the ice core. And once again, this is going from past to present, this direction. And what's noticeable about this, I should say this is from a glacier in Europe, so it's fairly close to pollution sources, unlike the glacier that we will be measuring. But what's pretty noticeable about these measurements is that there's a very large increase in the organic, pretty much right around this 1950 mark too, where the global inventories have this increase in organics. But just knowing how much carbon there is doesn't really tell us that much about what it looks like and potentially how the sources have changed or how the chemistry leading to the formation of these various species has changed. So there have been some people who've been trying to quantify what individual molecules might look like. So once again, we have past to present here, summer and winter. And here we have humus, so humic-like substances, humic-like substances plus diacids in the blue. And then this is the total of everything that they measured. So most of what they were measuring and trying to do these individual molecules remains unquantified. And in fact, the percentage going from back here to here increases. That's unquantified. And so we don't really know what's driving a lot of this increase in the observed carbon record. And this, once again, was from a glacier in Europe. Along with just kind of looking at it in terms of the total carbon, some people have used these tracer molecules, once again, to look at how the sources have perhaps changed. So here, once again, is vanillic acid, so a biomass burning tracer, and then methyl glyoxyl here, which in this study they determined was primarily associated with anthropogenic influences. And these folks used principal components analysis, along with several other tracer molecules that they measured, to try to back out how the different sources of aerosol or of organics to the ice core have been changing. And so in red is the principal component on both of these, and then here we have areas burned in black, and I can't read that from here. Non-methane VOC emissions. And so you can see that what they get out from these principal component analysis match fairly well with our estimates of what would be controlling these sources. And so you see that perhaps biomass burning has been decreasing in its influence in this area, and you see an increase in the anthropogenic component. But once again, just by using specific tracer molecules, you don't really get a sense of how the overall composition of the aerosol, what it looks like, of the organic aerosol looks like. And when we go back to this view of the world again, we can see that by using something like a bulk characterization of the organics, you can start saying something about what the organic might look like. So here, this green fraction of the pie has been changed into these different aerosol classes. So we have the hydrocarbon-like aerosol, semi-volatile, oxygenated, less volatile, and then in some cases they didn't separate these two out. So we have this color here, and then other. And as you can see, once again, that varies in time and space. And so this is the approach that we're going to be taking, is really doing this bulk analysis of what the organics look like. And I should mention that we're not the first to do this. There have been other measurements looking at the bulk composition. So this is, don't remember where this ice core was from, but this used Fourier transform ion cyclotron resonance, high-resolution mass spectrometry, to look at many more of the organic compounds that were present in the ice core than those tracer studies have been. But because of this technique, you have very limited time resolution. It needs a decent bit of samples. So here they just have measurements from 1950 and 1300. And here they are measuring different specific molecules, but they're measuring a lot of different types. So here, these are just a sum of the total formula of things that look like CX, HY, and then whatever this is here. So we have oxygen compounds, sulfur and oxygen, and then some nitrogen-containing compounds. And the big thing to notice here is that between 1300 and 1950, they saw a big increase in the percentage of the signal that contained these nitrogen and sulfur-containing ions in there, most likely due to changes in anthropogenic emissions of these compounds that are influencing the chemical composition and the chemistry. So the approach that we're going to take doesn't identify the molecules the same way, but what we make up, what we lose in kind of some of this sensitivity, we make up for in our temporal resolution. So I'm going to be using an aerosol mass spectrometer, hence the AMS view of the world pictures earlier. And how this works is you sample aerosol through this aerodynamic lens. It enters this particle time of flight region. You can get particle size and chemical composition information if you want. We will not be using this technique here. And then it is either vaporized on a 600-degree tungsten vaporizer. But in this configuration of the AMS, it is a soot particle AMS. So we additionally have this intercavity 1064 nanometer laser. So with this, we can see the soot that's present, as well as any metals that would be present. So both of these vaporizations are always happening at the same time. So we're getting complete organic, inorganic, as well as soot concentrations. And then after vaporization, they're ionized with universal electron impact ionization, and then are pulsed into a high-resolution time-of-flight mass spectrometer. So this is how we're measuring everything. How do we get the sample into the instrument? So this work was done at DRI with Joe McConnell's group, and here's a picture of the actual ice core melting apparatus. So you load about a meter-long section of ice into this. Here's a picture of the ice core, and here's the melter head. And essentially what happens is the melter head is a fancy hot plate for all intents and purposes. And the ice melts as it's in contact with it. And this outer layer here is just sent to waste. So that keeps any potential contamination out, especially from people touching it or use of tools in the lab or anything like that. This middle ring is what we were sampling off of. And then the inner ring here gets sent to the ICP-MS for various metals I should say that we're not the only instrument sampling off of this middle ring. They also had these traditional measurements as well as an SP2. So this ice or the water, the meltwater from the ice core, is transferred to an ultrasonic nebulizer that heats and cools the aerosol to eliminate the water. Because of this heating process, we do lose some semi-volatile compounds. We're working, or rather the grad student that was working with me on this is currently testing this at MIT with chamber studies, so monitoring the online composition as well as collecting it on filters and sampling it through this to look at impacts on the organic composition. But we do know that we'll lose things like ammonium nitrate to some extent. And so the dried aerosol is then split to both the SP2, which measures, it's the single particle soot photometer, so that'll give us black carbon concentrations, and then to the SPAMS, which will have inorganic, organic, as well as soot. Okay, so getting on to what we actually saw in these measurements. So just as a reminder, we were sampling ice that had been drilled from up here, so it's quite removed from any sorts of pollution sources. So we're not really going to be seeing the huge local pollution sources that have been observed in some of the European glaciers. And although it was nice, because in some sense you get a better view of kind of the regional climate that's perhaps a little more representative of global climate, it does mean that it's very low concentrations, and we're above detection limit, but not always by that much. So just to give you an example of kind of what we see, so here we just have the sulfate that we measured. And these are just a few snapshots of what we saw. So here, so you can see each of these data points is a mass spec. So we have subannual resolution that we're observing this. And here you can very clearly see the very large Laki Iceland volcanic eruption in 1783. And then moving on to more recently, we see Mount St. Helens. I believe this is Mount Redoubt, and then Mount Pinatubo. So we're pretty much seeing what we expect to see in this sulfate time series. For numerous reasons, the AMS was much better suited in this particular experiment to measuring ratios of compounds and not absolute values, mostly because seeing as how we're up here, there's a lot of influence from sea salt, which is a little difficult for the AMS. And also, the composition was changing so rapidly that it turns out that the ratios that the aerosol, that the AMS provides are much more robust than the concentrations. So these are the only concentration plots I'm going to be showing you, and from now on we're just going to be looking at various ratios. And the graph takes a little while to load. So this is what we measured. So here we're going from about 270 up to, I think it's 2013, 2014. And so this is just fraction of total signal. We have organic in the green, nitrate in the blue, sulfate in the red, and you can occasionally see some chloride or some ammonium in this fraction plot. And kind of what is most striking about this is that we can very clearly see the anthropogenic increase in sulfur here. But what I want to really emphasize is that all of this, these changes, are actually real changes to the sample that we're measuring. So this isn't noise. These are real changes. And so here, once again, we have the the Laki volcano that erupted right around here. So you can see the large increase in sulfate that occurred right then. And you can also see that I believe most of this nitrate is associated with sea salt. And you can see some of that in the increases in chloride that are associated with some of these nitrate peaks. But you do see that there's just very variable composition. And we're really hoping to use these variations to really start thinking about what some of the sources are and how those have perhaps changed. So going back to the anthropogenic sulfur, you can see here that you start seeing the sulfur increase, kind of levels out here, and then it starts decreasing again. And this agrees very well with kind of the timeline of global sulfur emissions. This is known very well. It's not surprising that we saw this. It's just kind of proof that we're measuring real things in the ice core. So I've motivated this whole talk with really thinking about how has this fraction been changing? And because this is a high resolution mass spectrometer, we can tell the different ions that are contributing to this organic signal. So this is how the organic has changed. So for the organic composition plots, I'm only going to be showing from about 1,000 to 2,000, not all the way back to 270. So what we have here is, once again, fraction, time. Here we have things that look like CXHY. These contain 1 oxygen. This color contains 2. These are nitrogen-containing compounds. And then we have some oxygenated nitrogen, as well as some sulfur-containing organics. And perhaps what is most striking about this is you do see year-to-year variability. Probably some of this are changes in large fires. We're still working on really interpreting what these changes are. But one of the things that's most striking is that the composition of the organics has clearly been changing from about 1950 or so on, and it's becoming much more reduced in nature. So we're having a smaller fraction of this are from oxygenated compounds. And so what we can look at is what are the specific ions that are making up this fraction of the plot? And that might give us some information about how sources have been changing. So this is now this green turned into a fraction. So this is just that green part. And here I've just indicated kind of the most abundant types of ions that we are seeing. So these types of ions are typically from alkyl groups, so aliphatic carbons. These sorts of ions are typically observed from unsaturated. And then we have ions that are indicative of aromatic species. And kind of unsurprisingly, there's year-to-year variation, as we'd expect, but composition is not changing all that much in kind of this bulk view of everything until we get to right over here. And I'm just going to zoom in on a few of the ions that we have here. And what we see here, so this is going from around 1880 up till present day. And what we see here is that these aliphatic, these alkyl ions have been increasing in abundance relative to the entire composition of the CXHY. And the aromatic ones have been decreasing in abundance. So this starts around 1950 or so, and we don't really know what would be causing this. So for anthropogenic influences, you would expect probably some increase in this, But you would also think that you might get increases in aromatics from combustion sources. But perhaps this is due to control technologies and that have been enforced throughout the Northern Hemisphere. But what we clearly see is that the CXHY ions are becoming more aliphatic-like in recent decades. So we can actually do something similar for the oxygenated ions. And what we see here, so this is from 1000 to 2000. So these are just the ions that have only one oxygen on them. And what we see here is, once again, another change that's happening, although this one starts happening a little earlier in time. So this might be due to both changes in emission sources as well as potentially some changes in the oxidative capacity of the atmosphere. And this is something we're still working on understanding. But in this cyan color here, we have things that are CN, H2N-3O+. And then here we have ions that there's 2 or fewer carbons, well, I guess 1 or 2 carbons, and hydrogens that are less than 2 times the number of carbons. So these sorts of ions come from some alcohols, carbonyls. We see those decreasing. These have numerous different sources. A lot of them come from fragmentation of some of the larger ions. And we're going to be using some principal component analysis to really start understanding why these changes are occurring in the atmosphere. So I motivated some of our previous work by showing you some plots I motivated our work by showing you some plots that some other people had taken of the bulk organic composition. And what they had observed was an increase in the sulfur, the organic sulfur, and the organic nitrogen. And we can start looking at that too. And we see that there are definitely changes in the composition of the organic sulfur. So here I've just pulled out 2 different time periods. So the red points are about 1200 to 1300. And then the blacks are 1910 to 2010. And what I have plotted here is the fraction of the signal that's CXHYS versus the fraction of the signal that also has an oxygen. So organic sulfates versus reduced sulfur compounds. And what we see here is that in present day, most of the organic sulfur are these oxygenated sulfates, so probably organic sulfates, whereas 1200 to 1300, we see these compounds, or these periods up here, where there's a large number of ions, well, relatively large number of ions, that have sulfur but no oxygen in them. So this is telling us something that the chemistry of the organic carbon and how it interacts with sulfur, so whether this is something like DMS oxidation leading to MSA, or SO2 interacting with organics to lead to organic sulfates, that is fundamentally changed between these 2 time periods. So in addition to sulfur, we can also look at nitrogen. And here I have changing composition of the nitrogen species. So because the nitrate in this data is predominantly influenced by sea salt, I'm not including that here. We actually can't see ammonium nitrate because the atomizer, the nebulizer that we were using was heated. And this should not in any way be taken to mean that these are the relative abundances of these different things. And so what I mean by that is you should not interpret that this 50% of the nitrogen is ammonium, and then 50% are reduced nitrogen compounds. There's some sensitivity things with the AMS that lead to quite a bit of uncertainty about the absolute abundance of these, but the relative changes are meaningful and can be interpreted. And what you can clearly see in just looking at these relative changes is that the past atmosphere was a situation in which a large fraction of the nitrogen, or at least in this viewpoint, a large fraction of the nitrogen, was organic. Whereas here, the inorganic, the ammonium, is 80 to 90% of the nitrogen. So if we start thinking about the nitrogen cycle and the implications for, I don't know what just happened. Okay. All right. So if we start thinking about changes to the nitrogen cycle and how that's been changing since the introduction of internal combustion engines, which output NOx, or the Haber-Bosch process for fertilization and food production, the organic nitrogen used to be a much more important player in the nitrogen cycle than it has been with these large anthropogenic sources of inorganic nitrogen. Just to give you an idea of kind of what some of this looks like, let's zoom in on one time period. So this is that 1200 to 1300 time period again. And you can see that in many instances, this organic nitrogen is very important in this total nitrogen measurement. And these increases in the ammonium are very tightly correlated with the sulfate signal that we see. So this could be a few different things. In this time period, these sulfur signals are predominantly due to volcanoes. So there can be ammonia emissions from volcanoes that are actually quite large. The other possibility is that you have some acid-base chemistry that's changing how far nitrogen is transported in different environments. But I think it's pretty safe to say that at least a good fraction of this is probably emissions of ammonia from the volcanoes in these time periods. So in terms of our understanding of the nitrogen cycle, because we've lived in this world here where most of it's been dominated by the inorganic types of nitrogen, we haven't really thought as much about the organic nitrogen and what its importance or its role both in air quality, ecosystem health, and climate has been. And that's something that I'm really interested in looking at, both because of its importance in understanding past climate and kind of what this benchmark is that we're comparing all of these climate projections to, as well as we know that NOx emissions are decreasing due to regulations. And there is a lot of talk, at least in the US, about the eventual need to control ammonia emissions due to concerns about particulate matter concentrations. So I'm really interested in this organic nitrogen. As you can just see kind of from this cartoon schematic, the organic nitrogen cycle, although this does include a few emissions of inorganic nitrogen, but it's very complex. There's numerous different sources, and the organic group can vary quite widely. So we have amines, urea, peptides or proteins, all of these different things that have numerous impacts on climate, ecosystem, and health, but that we don't really understand the chemistry of. And a lot of this has just been because many of these compounds are not very abundant in the atmosphere when compared to the composition of just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen compounds that have captivated most of our attention. There's also been difficulty in measuring them just because of the resolution of various mass spectrometers. But with improvements in resolution, as well as new ion chemistries for chemical ionization mass spectrometers that'll give us more selective detection of some of these compounds, we're really in a position now where we can start measuring these and start maybe understanding what their influence has been in the past, as well as potentially what it might continue to be in the future. So just a brief overview of the different projects that my two students are working on. Arum joined my group, who I think many of you know, because she was working here earlier, but she's going to be looking at amine chemistry. So we're going to be using flow tube measurements and looking at amine uptake initially into different kind of complex particles. And so what I mean by complex are either complex organics, so like SOA that we can generate in lab, or inorganics coated with some organic, to really start thinking about how does particle morphology might play a role in acid-base, or how do amine organic interactions affect their concentration in the atmosphere. And a lot of this work is really focused more on determining their uptake into submicron particles, not so much into the new particle formation and growth that I know a bunch of people here have been working on. The other project is Jennifer Berry will be working on it. And for this, we're really interested in the chemistry of some different nitrogen heterocycles. So the first compound that Jennifer will be looking at is the oxidation of pyrrole in the atmosphere. So this is emitted from biomass burning, and biomass burning is its only known source that is of any significance. And it has a very short lifetime in the atmosphere with respect to oxidation. However, no one's ever measured any of the products. So here's just an idea of what some of these products may look like. And by using structure-activity relationships, we can estimate lifetimes for these. And they also have very short lifetimes. So this chemistry will be very complex and fast. And we hope that by measuring some of these compounds, we can potentially provide very useful tracers for estimating things like photochemical age in the biomass burning plume, as well as potentially identify any compounds that may be toxic or detrimental to human or plant health. And lastly, the other current project that we're working on is going back to this amine chemistry, but really thinking about how amines might impact the atmosphere in terms of ozone production. So a lot of people have really been thinking about the role that amines play in new particle formation, but there hasn't really been a lot of thought about how they would impact ozone production. And this is mostly because they're present in very, very low abundances in most locations, PPT levels. However, in agricultural regions or downwind of something like carbon capture and storage, for which the current benchmarked technology are amine scrubbers, their concentrations can reach up to several ppb. So this is just results from just a steady state model, and this is the ozone production, instantaneous ozone production as a function of NOx. This is a log scale. And this is relative, this is ozone production with 1 ppb of amines added versus ozone production without. And so what this is somewhat trying to represent is this is the current chemical mechanisms used in regional and global models. And then this would be something more realistic for an agricultural region. And what you see here is that at high NOx, you can see up to around a 7% increase in this instantaneous ozone production, whereas at lower NOx, due to increased production of HO2, you see a decrease in ozone production. And so by no means am I suggesting that this will increase ozone by 7% in these areas, but I do think it'll have interesting impact on ozone formation and could potentially explain some issues that people have been seeing with ozone not responding to controls in places like the Central Valley of California quite how they'd expect it to. So just to conclude, leave you with kind of the three main plots from the presentation. So these are the ice core work once again. So we have year, fraction, and kind of the main things that we observed in this is that organics, the fractional importance of organics relative to other aerosol constituents has drastically decreased since the Industrial Revolution. But to really understand what this might do to some of the chemistry, we have to start looking at what the mass spec tell us about the composition of these organics. And so here we have the composition, and here we have the CXHY, one oxygen, multiple oxygens, and then some nitrogen. And what you see here is that in reality, this fraction that is non-oxygenated has been increasing steadily, especially since around the 1950s, which could be consistent with increases in anthropogenic VOC emissions. One thing that I meant to note earlier that I did not is that by nature of this remote location, you might expect to preferentially observe aerosol that is less oxygenated, just because it might not have been scavenged as efficiently. And for those of you who are used to looking at AMS data, this is also going to be more oxygenated than these graphs appear because CO2 has not been counted as an organic because it is also formed from carbonate. And given the large influence of sea salt, we could not determine the inorganic versus organic CO2. And so these might look less oxygenated than they really are. And then kind of the last point was how we've been changing the nitrogen composition in the atmosphere from locations where from periods where organic nitrogen was much more important to now we're in a regime where it's really inorganic nitrogen dominating. So just like to conclude with some few acknowledgments. So like I said, this was part of my postdoc work. So I was with Jesse Kroll at MIT, and Chris Lim was the graduate student who was working with me and who's doing the chamber experiments currently. This was done in conjunction with Aerodyne Research. Received extensive help from all of these folks. And then we were at DRI with Joe McConnell's group making these measurements. And they were making very many, numerous complementary measurements to ours. So with that, I'd take any questions.
Are there questions?
I'm just curious, can you pull out seasonality from these and look at summer versus winter?
Yes,
time
we will
periods?
be able to.
Okay.
We haven't gotten to that point in the data analysis yet, but we will definitely very interested in looking at that.
Okay. And then has anyone done any of these types of analysis for other ice cores, or is this the only one?
I don't know of any organic resolution that's at this high time resolution. A lot of people have looked. I don't know of any other AMS measurements, and I don't know of any long-term records like this.
I mean, is there thought to take ice cores in other places and do the same kind of analysis?
Oh yeah, we would love to go back. Joe has ice cores from Antarctica that would be really interesting to measure. We were kind of going with the Greenland one to start because there were higher concentrations. They were not that high, but they're higher than Antarctica. And the other thing is I'm very interested in taking one of the chemical ionization mass spectrometers there, if that would work, and to start getting some more kind of molecular information from individual species, but combining it with kind of this bulk approach. And that would give us some better tracer ions. Because one of the problems with kind of this bulk composition is that many molecules fragment into similar sorts of things. So it can be difficult to pull out sources. So if we have the molecular information combined with this, then we could do a very nice source characterization.
I've got a couple of questions. First is, do you have any idea what the source of the gaps in the data are? Is that melting?
So some of those were just our instrument being down. Yeah.
And then in the first relative concentration plot, from about 1300 to 1700 or so, it looks like a really diminished period for whatever the blue component is. Any speculation on that?
Yeah, so the blue is nitrate. And so because of the nebulizer that we were using that was heated, we don't have a total nitrate measurement in this. And so I think the nitrate that we are seeing, which I've shown using other measurements of sea salt, but I think it's predominantly sea salt. And so some changes in that are to be expected due to changes in sea ice extent in the near Greenland, and also just any changes in transport could also be affecting it. So I think you mentioned, this period right here. You might also notice that it also is very low kind of in this region, and which isn't to be expected because we know that nitrate has been increasing due to anthropogenic emissions of NOx, but that's just not the nitrate that we're sensitive to in this situation.
So I guess I'm a little confused about exactly how the analysis is working. So you're melting the ice, and the meltwater goes to the various instruments. I guess I don't really get with the ultrasonic nebulizer. I mean, most of these ionic species will have been dissolved in the water, and then you're sort of re-aerosolizing them.
Yeah, so the aerosol mass spectrometer needs to measure aerosol. Yeah. So we have to turn all the water into aerosol so that we can transport it through the aerodynamic lens to the vaporization.
So the aerosol actually depends on sort of the ability to form new salts and things yeah, so we definitely will be losing some semi-volatile, especially a lot of people have observed very small, highly oxygenated molecules that may evaporate from the aerosol that we would not be seeing. But people have observed those over this whole length of time, so I don't think it's going to be really biasing kind of this relative trend that we're seeing. And the other thing is, too, as I mentioned, what is deposited on the snow isn't even what is actually preserved in the ice core, because it can undergo photochemistry, it can undergo migration within the ice core. Things like melt events or things like that can drastically change what's preserved. So it's not an absolute representation of what was in the atmosphere, but it's kind of one of the best ones we can get at this point.
Yeah, many of the same questions. Thanks for a very interesting talk, by the way. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about this distinction between gases and aerosols? Because obviously most of the organic carbon is going to be in the gas phase, and it's all getting trapped in the ice. So, and I was wondering, if an answer can be found by comparing some AMS data, some atmospheric AMS data with these mass spectra to look for systematic differences.
Yeah, so a few notes about kind of the first part of your question is that there was also a dissolved organic carbon measurement. So we have a measurement of total carbon that I just don't have yet. So we will be looking at that and kind of teasing out potentially maybe how the gas phase organic species might be influencing some of this and what we can actually detect. The other part of the question was, what again?
Well, can you compare these AMS spectra to ambient data and see how they could be systematically different?
Yeah, so I have spent a lot of time looking at the individual mass specs and have been looking at the kind of present day measurements that we have. And we do see a lot of similarities in terms of, we see typical ion increases that are typically used as biomass burning tracers and all of that. But one of the biggest problems that we have in terms of comparing to AMS present day data is we can't use the CO2 in this data because of the sea salt. And a lot of AMS data is that CO2 peak is very large and its abundance is very important in determining how oxygenated things are. And so not having the organic CO2 is kind of a real limitation in terms of comparing it to the present day. But we are hoping that by kind of looking at these different ion classes that make up the molecules, we can make comparisons to what present day kind of the typical AMS principal components look like for various factors and to understand those.
Is there an explanation for the top two plots? There's something looks like happened right around World War II, about a 10-year period where the nitrate kind of spikes.
Oh, right up here.
I was just wondering, I mean, in the beginning you were talking about, well, and one of the things I was wondering about is just any events in history that you could tease out, like Mount Pinatubo or something like that. But that one stands out as being, different than the previous 1,000 years.
Yeah, so the problem with the nitrate that we're seeing here is that I think it's going to be very sensitive to local transport to the core, and so we'd really, or to where it was deposited. And so I think in order to kind of understand some of these nitrate ones, we'd really need to incorporate some modeling to tease out how transport events are really influencing some of these concentrations. I have been looking to see if we can tease out anything with potential decreases in biogenic emissions during the Little Ice Age and how that might impact the organic composition. And I think we're seeing some promising things there, but we're still really looking at the data. Like I said, I got this about 3.5 months before I left that job. But yeah, the problem with pulling out individual events is that it really depends on the transport to the site and what was actually deposited there. So for instance, thinking way back to when I showed the only absolute concentrations, the sulfate, and we had Mount Redoubt was the same concentration of sulfate deposited as Mount Pinatubo was. Mount Pinatubo was a much, much larger eruption, but Mount Redoubt was much closer. So we're just more influenced by that. And so that's one of the things that's kind of difficult in really interpreting some of these measurements.
All right, if there is no more questions, let's thank the speaker again.